In the dim glow of a flickering oil lamp, Colonel Percy Fawcett leaned over his battered wooden desk in a cramped study littered with rolled-up maps, worn notebooks, and strange trinkets collected from a lifetime of expeditions. Outside, the rain pelted against the small London window, a constant reminder that the civilized world was a cage he longed to escape. For his mind was far away in the dense emerald labyrinth of the Amazon, chasing whispers of a city so ancient and so rich that even the oldest myths struggled to describe it. The lost city of Z. He wore his usual expedition attire, khaki shirt tucked into matching trousers, the creases softened by years of sweat and soil. A broad leather belt carrying a brass compass that had guided him across continents, weathered boots scuffed from mountain trails, the wide-brim hat that shaded his determined eyes from the merciless sun. This uniform had become an extension of his identity, and it would accompany him into the green hell once again. Fawcett's obsession began years earlier when, in the archives of the Royal Geographical Society, he stumbled upon a faded document penned by a Portuguese explorer in 1753, describing a ruined city deep in the heart of Brazil. Its streets paved with stone, its temples adorned with gold, and its walls covered in strange carvings unlike anything known to European scholars. The account had been dismissed by most as either a drunken fantasy or an exaggerated traveler's tale. But Fawcett's instincts told him otherwise, for he believed in the possibility that remnants of a lost, advanced civilization still lay hidden beneath the choking vines of the jungle, waiting to rewrite the history of human achievement. Through years of painstaking research, he cross-referenced indigenous legends, colonial records, and the oral histories of tribes who spoke of El Dorado not as a mere city of gold, but as a cradle of knowledge and idea that both thrilled and terrified him. He imagined streets that glittered under the tropical sun, a network of waterways teeming with strange fish, monumental statues whose eyes seemed to follow intruders, and perhaps even libraries of stone where the wisdom of an entire people had been preserved. The Amazon, however, was not a kind host. Countless expeditions had vanished into its depths, swallowed by a landscape that could rot leather, rust, steel, and consume a man's spirit long before hunger or disease claimed his body. But Fawcett's resolve was iron. This was not simply another mapping mission or a bid for glory. It was a quest to prove that the arrogance of the modern world had blinded it to the achievements of ancient ones. In the early spring of 1925, with the support of a few private sponsors and the Royal Geographical Society's reluctant blessing, he began assembling his final expedition. Accompanying him would be his eldest son, Jack, and Jack's close friend, Raleigh Rimmel, both young, eager, and as yet untouched by the crushing weight of jungle hardship. Their preparations were meticulous, rifles cleaned and oiled, machetes sharpened, crates packed with dried meat, hardtack biscuits, and sacks of flour. Medical kits stocked with quinine to fight malaria, bandages, and vials of antiseptic. And, of course, bundles of letters and diaries to record every discovery and hardship. Yet even as they packed their gear, Fawcett knew that success depended less on equipment than on patience, adaptability, and a kind of stubborn courage that refused to be broken by swarms of insects. The fevered delirium of disease or the oppressive, endless walls of green. Before departing, he gave a small lecture to a handful of journalists, their notebooks scratching furiously as he declared, "We go in search of an ancient truth. We do not return. Know that the jungle has claimed us, but the idea of Z will outlive us all." Days later, dressed in their khaki uniforms and wide-brimmed hats, the three men boarded a steamer bound for Rio de Janeiro, the city that would serve as their gateway into the heart of darkness. The journey upriver began on a modest steam launch, its black smoke curling into the humid air, carrying them past villages on stilts and wide expanses of glistening water where pink river dolphins surfaced briefly before vanishing. As they traveled deeper, the river narrowed, its banks rising into walls of tangled vegetation alive with movement, monkeys leaping from branch to branch, bright macaws wheeling overhead, and the constant unseen rustle of creatures watching from the shadows. Nights were spent in hammocks strung between trees, mosquito nets draped over them, air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The soundtrack was an unending chorus of chirps, croaks, and distant roars that seemed to echo from another world entirely. Fawcett's journal entries from those early days brimmed with optimism. He noted sightings of unusual pottery fragments. Along the shore, the sudden appearance of geometric earthworks in cleared patches of forest, and cryptic symbols carved into exposed stone. Each clue was a thread pulling them deeper into the jungle's heart. But the Amazon tested them swiftly. Heavy rains swelled the river, forcing detours through flooded plains. Clouds of biting insects left their skin raw and swollen. Food supplies began to dwindle faster than anticipated. Raleigh, still new to the rigors of such travel, battled bouts of fever. His face pale beneath the brim of his hat, yet he refused to turn back, driven as much by loyalty to Jack as by the tantalizing promise of discovery. Jack, for his part, had inherited his father's quiet determination. When Fawcett stumbled, it was Jack who offered a steadying hand. When morale faltered, it was Jack who recited fragments of poetry to lift their spirits. Weeks passed before they reached the fringes of territory rarely visited by outsiders. The maps grew vague and local guides, though respectful, refused to continue, citing spirits and ancient curses that guarded the paths ahead. Undeterred, Fawcett paid them for their service, shouldered his pack, adjusted the leather strap of his satchel, pressed onward with his son and Raleigh, navigating by compass and instinct alone. The air grew heavier, the forest darker. Roots twisted from the ground like the backs of great serpents, and the calls of birds were replaced by a profound, almost oppressive silence. It was here, among the looming ceiba trees and the tangled vines, that they began to find signs unlike any they had encountered before, stone fragments etched with unfamiliar patterns, shards of pottery too fine to belong to the nomadic tribes, and in one clearing, a toppled statue of a humanoid figure. With an elongated face and a crown-like headdress, its stone eyes blank yet strangely accusatory. Fawcett knelt before it, brushing away moss with gloved fingers, his breath shallow. He felt they were on the threshold of something immense, something that would validate every sacrifice. But the jungle was watching, that night as they camped. Beside a narrow stream, a sudden rustling in the undergrowth brought all three men to their feet. Rifles raised, they scanned the darkness, seeing nothing but the gleam of moonlight on wet leaves until a shape moved, low and fast, vanishing. Before a shot could be fired, the following morning they found fresh footprints near the camp, barefoot, human, but unlike any tribe Fawcett knew. The toes long and splayed, the impressions deep, as though made by someone carrying a great weight. The air between them grew. Tense, they were no longer alone. As the day wore on, they noticed more of the strange footprints, always just ahead, always vanishing into the shadows. That night, Fawcett lay awake in his hammock, listening to the steady drip of water from the canopy, the occasional snap of a branch, and somewhere, far off yet impossibly close, the sound of drums echoing through the darkness, their rhythm slow, deliberate, and ominously patient-like, a heartbeat waiting for something to happen. Morning came not with the gentle warmth of sunlight, but with a damp, clinging mist that seemed to press against their skin like a living thing. The pale light barely filtering through the thick canopy above, as Colonel Percy Fawcett, his khaki shirt already damp with sweat, adjusted the strap of his satchel and signaled for Jack and Raleigh to break camp. The strange barefoot tracks had not faded overnight, if anything. More had appeared, circling the site as though the unseen watchers had moved closer during their sleep. Jack's wide-brim hat was pulled low over his eyes, shadowing the worry that flickered there, while Raleigh, though pale from the fever that still clung to him, tightened his leather belt and forced a grim smile, refusing to show weakness. They moved in single file, machetes slicing through the stubborn wall of vines and undergrowth, their boots squelching in the sodden ground, the air thick with the scent of rot and wild orchids. As they pressed deeper, the forest began to change trees, grew taller and more widely spaced, allowing shafts of golden light to pierce the gloom, revealing glimpses of shapes that made the heart quicken, low mounds overgrown with ferns, rectangular stone blocks half buried in earth, and here and there, the faint outline of what might have been a road, its paving stones long cracked, but still holding the straightness of deliberate design. Fawcett stopped often to examine these relics, brushing away moss to reveal intricate carvings of animals, both familiar and strange serpents with feathered crests, birds with human eyes, and a recurring symbol that looked like a circle surrounded by radiating lines, perhaps a sun, perhaps something else entirely. The deeper they went, the stronger the signs became, fragments of pottery, a half-collapsed wall, and once, in a clearing, the stump of what might have been a colossal column, its surface etched with spirals so precise they seemed to pulse in the shifting light. But with each discovery came a growing unease. More footprints, always barefoot, some small, some impossibly large, and occasionally a faint sound from the shadows, the snap of a twig, the whisper of leaves where no wind blew. Fawcett's compass still pointed true, but he had begun to trust his instincts more than the needle, sensing that the jungle itself was funneling them toward something, guiding and testing them in equal measure. On the fourth day since the footprints first appeared, they reached a river narrower than the Amazonian giants they had traveled before, but swift and deep, its surface broken by jagged rocks. Here they paused to refill their canteens, Jack kneeling at the water's edge when a flash of color caught his eye, a shard of glazed ceramic, impossibly smooth, painted in hues that had not dulled despite what must have been centuries of burial. Beneath the silt, Fawcett held it in his palm, the weight solid yet somehow electric, a tangible fragment of the city he had dreamed of for years. That night they camped on the far bank, hammocks swaying gently between ancient trees whose roots seemed to clutch at the earth like the fingers of buried giants. As the oil lamp's glow painted long shadows, Raleigh broke the silence, his voice low. "Colonel, what if they're not just following us? What if they're leading us?" Fawcett looked at him for a long moment, the brim of his hat hiding his eyes before replying, "Then we must decide whether to follow willingly." Hours later, as Jack kept watch, the drums began again, closer this time, the rhythm faster, as if something unseen was gathering speed. And then came the sound of water being disturbed downstream, not the gentle splash of a fish, but the deliberate steps of something wading through the shallows. Jack gripped his rifle, scanning the shadows, when a shape emerged at the edge of the firelight, human in form, impossibly tall, skin painted in swirling patterns of red and black, eyes reflecting the flames with an almost metallic gleam. It stood still for a moment, then raised one long arm and pointed into the darkness beyond the camp, toward a barely visible path between the trees, before turning and melting back into the jungle without a sound. Jack woke his father at once, and Fawcett listened intently, his expression unreadable. "We follow at first light," he said simply, as though the appearance of a painted giant in the dead of night were nothing more than another signpost on their journey. The next day the path led them upward, into higher ground where the air was marginally cooler, the forest floor drier, and the remnants of stonework, more frequent walls still standing waist-high, ranged in patterns that suggested streets or plazas. Here they found a stone basin filled with clear water, its rim carved into the likeness of a serpent swallowing its own tail, the symbol repeating in smaller forms around the edge. Fawcett drank deeply, then splashed his face, feeling a clarity of mind that was almost alarming. Jack and Raleigh followed suit, both remarking that the water seemed colder and purer than any they had tasted before. That evening, as the sun dipped below the canopy and shadows lengthened, they reached a rise from which they could see, through breaks in the trees, what appeared to be the faint outline of a massive stone structure, perhaps a pyramid, perhaps a temple, its top just visible above the jungle's embrace. Excitement surged through them, exhaustion momentarily forgotten. They made camp early, intending to approach at dawn. But that night, the drums did not come from one direction, they came from all around. 100 different rhythms overlapping until the air itself seemed to vibrate. And then came the chanting, low and guttural, carrying words they could not understand, and woven through it, a sound that made the hair on Fawcett's neck rise, a deep, resonant horn, as if some colossal creature were calling across the ages. He lay in his hammock, hat tilted low, boots still on, hand resting on the grip of his revolver, listening as the jungle's chorus built into something almost unbearable. And then, just as suddenly, stopped, leaving a silence so absolute it felt as though the world itself had paused, waiting for the next move. Dawn came like a slow exhalation, the mist retreating reluctantly as pale shafts of sunlight pierced the jungle canopy, casting shifting patterns on the damp forest floor where Percy, Fawcett, Jack, and Raleigh stood silently, each adjusting the straps of their satchels and checking their rifles before setting out toward the faint silhouette they had glimpsed the night before. Their khaki shirts clung to them with the weight of humidity, wide-brim hats tilted low to shield their eyes from the glare, boots sinking into the spongy earth with each measured step, the air heavy with the mingled scents of wet leaves, earth, and something faintly metallic that none of them could quite place. The path the painted figure had pointed toward seemed almost too deliberate, roots and vines pushed aside just enough for passage. The ground worn smooth as though by generations of careful tread, yet no bird called from the branches, no insect hummed in the stillness. It was a silence that pressed against the ears like deep water. As they advanced, the forest began to thin, replaced by towering stone pillars, draped in moss and strangler figs. Their surfaces carved with the same circlandras, symbol they had seen before, now worn but still commanding. The pillars grew closer together until they formed a kind of avenue, leading their eyes inevitably toward a massive stone structure that rose from the earth like the memory of a dream, its base lost to undergrowth, but its upper tiers still visible, each level adorned with angular patterns and what seemed to be reliefs of human figures, their proportions slightly alien, heads elongated, arms raised toward a central sun. Fawcett stopped to take it in, the sight more powerful than any story or map could have prepared him for, and for a moment he removed his hat, running a hand through his damp hair, a gesture both of reverence and disbelief. Jack's eyes shone with the thrill of discovery, while Raleigh's face was pale but intent, as though the fever had been burned away by sheer awe. They approached slowly, the sound of their boots on ancient stones startling in the otherwise perfect quiet, and began to climb the wide, shallow steps that led up to a broad terrace where the air felt cooler. It's almost charged, as though the stones themselves radiated a long-forgotten energy. Here they found the remnants of what must once have been an entrance to massive stone doors, their surfaces covered in dense carvings of intertwined serpents and geometric shapes. One door cracked and partially shifted aside, leaving a gap, just wide enough for a man to slip through. Fawcett led the way, drawing a small lantern from his satchel and striking it a light. The golden glow spilled into a vast interior chamber, revealing walls of polished stone inlaid with gold that had dulled to a deep, rich patina, and in the center, a circular dais surrounded by low stone benches. Round the perimeter stood tall statues, each representing a figure in the same khaki-colored stone, their clothing unfamiliar but finely rendered, their eyes set with dark stones that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The floor was littered with fragments of pottery and bone, some human, some not, their arrangement too deliberate to be mere chance. Fawcett moved from carving to carving, tracing the symbols with gloved fingers, muttering quietly to himself, occasionally glancing at his compass as though expecting it to spin wildly, but the needle remained steady. Jack explored the far side of the chamber where he found a series of niches cut into the wall, containing a small clay tablet covered in raised markings unlike any known script. Raleigh, meanwhile, knelt near the dais, brushing away dust, to reveal a mosaic of the same sun symbol, its rays reaching outward to touch depictions of rivers, mountains, and strange constellations unfamiliar to any of them. "It's a map," he whispered, and the sound of his voice in the vast space seemed to stir something unseen. A faint shiver of air moved through the chamber, carrying with it a scent both sweet and acrid, like flowers left too long in the sun. Fawcett joined him at the dais, kneeling to study the mosaic, noting that one of the rivers depicted matched the path they had taken to reach this place. His mind raced. If the rest of the symbols corresponded to real geography, they might be looking at a guide to other cities. Perhaps an entire network of advanced settlements lost to time. But before they could study it further, a sound echoed from the entrance, soft at first, like cloth against stone, then louder, deliberate footsteps approaching. They froze, lantern light trembling slightly as Jack raised his rifle toward the doorway. The figure that emerged was unlike the painted sentinel from before. This one was smaller, cloaked in layers of woven fibers dyed in deep greens and browns, face obscured by a mask of carved wood painted with the same sun symbol. One hand it carried a staff topped with a cluster of feathers, in the other a small clay vessel that steamed faintly. Without a word, it stepped forward, set the vessel upon the dais, and gestured for them to drink. The movement slow, ritualistic. Fawcett hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. But the masked figure simply stood there, the stillness of its posture somehow more commanding than any threat. At last, he took the vessel, its contents a thick, dark liquid with an earthy aroma, and lifted it toward his lips but before he could taste it. The masked figure reached out and pressed a finger to the center of the sun mosaic, causing a low rumble to rise from beneath the floor. Dust drifted down from the ceiling, the statues seemed to shift imperceptibly. And from somewhere deep within the structure came the sound of water rushing faster and faster, as if an underground river had suddenly been set loose. The masked figure backed away into the shadows, disappearing through a side passage just as the rumble grew to a roar. Fawcett set the vessel down, eyes darting between Jack and Raleigh. The floor beneath them trembled, a fine crack tracing its way across the mosaic like a serpent slithering outward from the sun's center. The air thickened, the lantern's flame guttered, and from beyond the doorway came the unmistakable sound of drums, no longer distant, but pounding as though they were inside the very walls, each beat shaking the air like the footsteps of something immense, drawing ever closer. The roar beneath their feet grew into a shudder that rattled the very stones. Dust drifting from the carved ceiling as Percy Fawcett tightened the strap of his satchel and motioned for Jack and Raleigh to stay close, their khaki shirts clinging. With sweat, wide-brim hats tilted low to keep falling grit from their eyes. Boots crunching on fragments of bone and pottery as they backed toward the doorway. But the narrow entrance they had come through was no longer the still gap between the doors. It was now sealed. The massive stone slabs grinding together with an agonizing slowness until only darkness remained beyond, the sound of the lock echoing. Like a final verdict, the lantern flickered violently, shadows of the statues lurching across the walls as though they were alive, their dark stone eyes seeming to glint with some internal awareness. A sudden gust of air swept through the chamber, carrying with it that same sweet, acrid scent, stronger now, almost dizzying. And somewhere deep in the temple, a low horn sounded, its mournful tone reverberating through the stone until it seemed to vibrate in their bones. "We're not alone," Jack whispered. But even as he spoke, the floor gave another lurch, and the mosaic beneath the dais cracked wide, revealing a black void into which the fragments of stone began to slide, vanishing soundlessly. From that void rose a rush of cold, damp air, and with it a faint glow, pale green and shifting, as though light were being reflected through moving water. Fawcett, jaw set, stepped to the edge and peered down, seeing not water, but a network of narrow tunnels lined with carvings rows upon rows of the sun symbol, each one subtly different, radiating in spirals rather than straight lines. Before they could decide whether to descend, the masked figure reappeared in the far archway, the staff in one hand, the other hand raised in a silent command to follow. Without waiting for agreement, it turned and disappeared down a side corridor, the glow from the fissure dimming behind them as they gave chase, boots slapping against worn stone, satchels bouncing at their hips. The corridor narrowed, the ceiling lowering until they had to stoop, and then abruptly widened again into a small chamber where water dripped steadily from a crack in the ceiling into a shallow stone basin. The masked figure knelt, dipped its fingers into the water, and smeared 2 streaks across the front of its wooden mask. The gesture deliberate, almost ceremonial, before turning toward a wall covered entirely in relief carvings of serpents coiling around a central figure with elongated limbs and a head crowned with what looked like a halo of flames. It placed its palm against the central carving, with a sound like stone grinding against stone. A section of the wall slid inward to reveal a steep staircase spiraling down into darkness. Fawcett exchanged a glance with Jack and Raleigh equal. Part suspicion and compulsionate without a word, began the descent. The lantern's light catching on damp walls as the air grew cooler and heavier, tasting faintly of minerals and something metallic. The staircase ended in a vast subterranean hall whose ceiling was lost in shadow, the floor a grid of massive stone slabs, some cracked, others discolored as though by heat. Along the walls stood more statues, but these were different half human, half serpent. Their eyes inlaid not with dark stone, but with something that glimmered faintly green in the lantern light. In the center of the hall lay a colossal circular stone, its surface engraved with a complex spiral of symbols that seemed to shift subtly when viewed from different angles, an effect that made Raleigh stumble slightly as though the ground had tilted beneath him. Before they could examine it, a deep, grinding sound came from the far end of the hall, and a set of double doors at least 20 feet high began to open inward, revealing a blackness so complete it seemed to absorb the lantern light. The masked figure stepped toward the darkness, then stopped, turning its head toward Fawcett in a way that felt both questioning and warning. Fawcett took a single step forward, the sound of his boot echoing in the vast space sand. That was when the first movement came from the shadows beyond the doors. It was not the cautious step of a human, nor the sudden leap of an animal, but a slow, deliberate unfurling, as though something long coiled was awakening after centuries of stillness. A glimmer of green light swept across what might have been scales, each one the size of a man's hand, followed by a hiss so deep it felt like the earth itself exhaling. Jack raised his rifle instinctively, but Fawcett put out a hand to stop him. Eyes fixed on the blackness as the shape within began to slide forward, the sound of its movement a dry rasp, like stone on stone. The masked figure took several steps back, lowering its staff and bowing its head, as though acknowledging an authority older than the walls themselves. Raleigh's breathing quickened, his fingers tightening on the strap of his satchel, and in that moment the lantern flame guttered once, twice, and went out, plunging them into a darkness broken only by the faint green glow of the creature's eyes as it crossed the threshold into the hall. The faint green glow from the creature's eyes pulsed slowly in the darkness, casting fractured reflections on the polished stone floor as Percy Fawcett. Jack and Raleigh stood frozen, the weight of their rifles suddenly insignificant in the oppressive air. Their khaki shirts clung cold to their skin, the brims of their hats shadowing faces pale with a mixture of awe and primal fear. The serpent's massive head slid fully into view, each scale catching the dim light in an oily shimmer. Its elongated pupils, narrowing and expanding as it studied them in complete, unnerving silence. Its breath came in slow, humid waves, smelling faintly of earth after rain and something far older, like the scent of stones sealed away for centuries. The masked figure remained bowed, unmoving, as if this moment had been anticipated for generations. The staff resting across its knees in an attitude of submission, Fawcett's hand tightened on the strap of his satchel, instinctively aware that sudden movement might trigger something final. Instead, he slowly drew from it the small, leather-bound notebook in which he had sketched every carving, every symbol, every strange sight since they had entered the temple. Holding it open to the sun symbol map, he raised it slightly toward the creature, unsure why, but sensing on some level that this was the only offering he could make. The serpent's eyes flickered toward the page, then back to his face, and without warning, it lowered its head until the tip of its snout nearly touched the stone. The massive coils behind it shifting with a sound like boulders grinding in a landslide. It exhaled sharply, and with that breath came a rush of air that extinguished what little glow the lantern's dying wick had been clinging to, plunging them into a darkness so total it was almost tangible. In that blackness, They heard the faint metallic sound of something being set down on stone, followed by the serpent's slow retreat into whatever depths it had emerged from. The grinding of the great doors sealing once again with a shudder. That seemed to ripple through the floor. When the silence returned, it was absolute no dripping water. No whisper of Iran for a moment. They might have been standing in a tomb suspended outside of time. Then, from somewhere near the dais, in the center of the hall, came a faint glimmer. Jack struck a match, the flare revealing a small object resting on the spiral-engraved stone, a disk of gold no larger than a man's palm, its surface etched with the sun symbol, but here the rays curved inward rather than outward, converging on a single point. Around its edge ran a band of symbols in the same unknown script they had seen on the clay tablets, but sharper, as though freshly carved. Fawcett picked it up, the metal warm despite the coolness of the hall, and felt an almost imperceptible vibration through his fingertips like the hum of a distant engine. Raleigh leaned in to examine it, eyes wide with something between greed and reverence, whispering, "It's a key. It has to be." Before Fawcett could answer, the masked figure rose and gestured toward the staircase, its movements urgent. Now, no longer the slow, deliberate pace it had kept before. They followed, the air growing warmer as they ascended, the faint glow of daylight drawing them upward until they emerged not into the temple's entrance hall, but into a narrow canyon of stone walls overgrown with vines, the sky a thin strip far above. Behind them, the passage sealed itself with a grinding rumble, the wall now indistinguishable from the rest of the cliff face. The masked figure stopped, pointed eastward where the jungle canopy stretched in unbroken waves, and then tapped the golden disc in Fawcett's hand twice before vanishing into the green with a silence that made them doubt it had ever been there at all. For a long moment they stood in that canyon, the oppressive silence of the temple replaced by the chaotic chorus of the living jungle birds shrieking, insects buzzing, leaves whispering in the humid breeze. Jack finally broke the silence. "We have to go back," he said, eyes fixed on the sealed wall. Fawcett shook his head slowly, slipping the disc into his satchel. "Not yet," he replied, voice low. "First we find where this leads." As they hacked their way east through the undergrowth, the weight of the disc seemed to grow, pulling at Fawcett's shoulder like an anchor. And though the sun was high, the jungle light seemed dimmer, the shadows deeper. By the second day, they had found the river from the mosaic map, its waters sluggish and dark, flanked by ruins, half swallowed by the forest columns, staircases, and carvings that matched nothing in any known culture, each marked with that inverted sun symbol. On the third night, as they camped on a small rise above the river, Fawcett awoke to find Raleigh gone, his bedroll empty, footprints leading down toward the water. Following them by moonlight, he reached the riverbank just in time to see Raleigh, standing waist-deep in the current, the golden disc in his hands, eyes fixed on something unseen in the black water before him. Fawcett called his name, but Raleigh didn't turn. Instead, he slowly sank beneath the surface without a sound, the disc vanishing with him. Jack arrived moments later, breathless, but there was no sign of Rallino ripples, no bubbles, only the endless, glassy flow of the river. For hours they searched, to no avail, until exhaustion forced them to stop. At dawn, Fawcett stood alone at the riverbank, staring at the spot where Raleigh had disappeared, when a glint caught his eye in the shallows, the golden disc, lying half-buried in silt, as though it had been placed there deliberately. He picked it up, and for the first time noticed that the symbols along its edge had changed, now forming a different pattern, one that matched a set of carvings they had seen deep within the temple. He turned it over in his hand, feeling again that faint vibration, stronger now and in the distance. Far beyond the trees, there came a low, resonant horn call that was answered faintly by another somewhere behind him, closer. Jack emerged from the jungle with their gear, eyes wide at the sound. "They know we have it," he said. Fawcett slipped the disc back into his satchel, tightened the strap, and looked east toward the rising sun. "Then we'd better keep moving," he said, though his voice carried the weight of a man who understood that whatever they had found was only the beginning, and that the true lost city of Z was still waiting, somewhere beyond the edge of every map.